And then when I was 20, the dad that I thought was dead my whole life, he reached out and said, I'm alive. I'm living in Florida. That's where he'd been. And I'm dying. And he was dying of cancer. And he said he wanted to come home. And it was really interesting to realize we are home. Like this family that he has had no contact with for 20 years, we're home to him. And like the sadness there, it brought up a lot of pain. And I didn't know how to process that. I didn't know how to feel it and like allow it. And I started drinking a lot. And it's interesting because the reason that I hadn't known my dad is because he was a drug addict and because he'd left. And then I started to do the thing. I started to like grow into the addict that he had become.
My first question is, what is addiction?
Ooh, what is addiction? Well, I'm going to give my own version, which I guess is what I'm supposed to do. And to me, addiction is, anytime we're consuming something, whether it's a substance or a food or even a person, media, we can ask this question, is this numbing me or is this nourishing me? Because I could eat a whole pint of ice cream and it could feel really nourishing and really good. Maybe I just like it's coming from this really loving place. Or it could be me trying to cover up a feeling and ignore something and push something down. So to me, addiction is when the numbing takes over. And in my life, the way that showed up is that the things in my life started to suffer. It became something that impaired relationships, my career, my health. Yeah, addiction, there's not to me a bright line. And that's sort of the insidiousness of it, right? Is for everyone, it might be a little bit different, but asking, is this numbing or is this nourishing? When I was 3 months old, my dad, he was a drug addict and he had been an addict and it had been very tumultuous in the household because I had an older brother and my mom was no longer someone who was going to just be okay with him selling all of their stuff to go buy drugs, things that were not okay before, but suddenly with 2 kids, really, it was clear that she had to draw a line. And when I was born and things got really bad, she said, you can either get clean or you can leave. And my dad chose to leave. He called for a few years and would just check in with different members of the family. And then he just disappeared. And everyone sort of assumed that he died. And he was very much a cautionary tale for me of what addiction and alcoholism can do. My mom was ahead of her time in many ways. She would talk about him as a sick person. She wanted to make sure her kids didn't grow up thinking that this was a man who didn't care. He was someone who didn't know how to function without drugs. And so I knew that intellectually. And I also knew that I didn't have a dad and that he had made a decision that had caused my mom a lot of pain. So I grew up in a single parent household with a mom who was on welfare and very much struggled without much support and also loved us so much. And I got so much stability in some ways. But I bring my dad up because he was sort of a part of my story that I thought didn't matter. I didn't want to be a cliche, like that girl who had daddy issues. And so most of my life, I was just like, you can't miss what you never had. And I really believed that because I never had a dad. So I didn't miss him. And I also had a mom, again, who was ahead of her time and talked about, so addiction might run in your family. Like we can look back in my family tree, all of my great grandparents, addiction and alcoholism are not new. And she talked about this, she warned me about this. And so I think it's important to mention we can have this like intellectual knowledge, and then there's life, and then there's experiences. I really like this phrase that says, genetics loads the gun, environment pulls the trigger. And I don't think we've nailed down a marker for addiction, like the gene or something. But, there's enough research to say that it runs in families. And in many ways, the trigger was pulled, but not until much later. I went through life very much like a normal, high functioning, but in retrospect, really anxious kid. I had a lot of fears about stuff that wasn't normal. And I only know that now looking back. I would not be able to sleep all night because I was so worried about developing this certain kind of disease. I had these tendencies where I was already trying to maybe control my environment and get really vigilant and really kind of contracted and worried. And I was just a really deeply feeling, sensitive kid. And I think that I want to name that a lot of people who become addicts and alcoholics are really sensitive. Not all of us, but I think that especially now as a mom, I'm really interested in sensitivity and how to equip kids that feel it all from a pretty young age with tools because I don't know that I had those. I was just highly aware of pain and mortality and impermanence, and it was hard for me. And so I found ways to deal with that. And first, it was like losing myself in books. And then I got older and it was eating. I should mention my mom was a food addict. She was morbidly obese, fluctuated hundreds of pounds my whole life. She had her own way of dealing with the pain. And I definitely absorbed that. So food became a vice. And then as I got older and I'm a female in this society and I see the way my mom's treated in the world, genuinely like a second class citizen. Often, she would be laughed at and like disregarded. And it was like, fat is bad, fat is bad. And I learned that and I internalized that. And I couldn't be fat. So I had to figure out a way to be essentially addicted to food and not be fat. And I found binging and purging. And my eating disorder really sprouted up when I was a teenager. And then, I think there's like the things that we do to deal with pain. I couldn't have told you why I was doing it. I remember thinking, this is disgusting. I'm throwing up my food. Like, ew, how gross. But there was something working its way out. There was numbing. That was the earliest way I saw addiction really take over. And there wasn't just the bulimia, there was also the judgment of the bulimia, like how I said, oh, this is so gross. So there's the things that I was doing. And then there was like another part of me that was looking at me and being like, you are disgusting. So I think within addicts, a lot of the time, there are many different layers of shame. And we begin to put these on. I can just look back and see the ways in which I began to kind of bundle myself against the world, bundle myself in eating, bundle myself in judging, bundle myself in people pleasing. That was another big part of my story is I learned that if I could be, I'm going to say perfect, then I was received in a way that was really rewarding for me if I could make my mom feel good. She struggled with depression, obviously addiction. She had no support, very few friends. And I can see myself really taking on a lot of her pain as a kid and performing. If I get straight A's, if I'm a star athlete, if I'm popular and beautiful, homecoming court, then I'm okay. Then I'm worthy. And the simplest way to put it is I pushed down the self, right? By trying on all of these things to either numb who I was or be who I thought you wanted to be. And that began to show up when I got a little bit older. And I experimented with drinking in high school and I liked it, but I didn't have one of those experiences where I was like, oh, here it is. This is it. It was great, but I felt very in control. And then when I was 20, the dad that I thought was dead my whole life, he reached out and said, I'm alive. I'm living in Florida. That's where he'd been. And I'm dying. And he was dying of cancer. And he said he wanted to come home. And it was really interesting to realize we are home. Like this family that he has had no contact with for 20 years, we're home to him. And like the sadness there. And my brother he had a lot of anger. He had no interest in meeting him and getting to know him. But I was just like, oh my God, I have a dad and he wants to meet me and he's coming home. Then he took a year to get here. And in that year, he got pretty close to death. When he finally arrived back where he had left us, he was just very emaciated and hollow and frail. But I recognized his eyes. Everyone had always said we had the same eyes. And it was just like, this very strange connection, and I latched onto it. I went to see him every single day, and he died within 2 months. It was 60 days. I met him on New Year's Eve, and he died on February 12th. So, wow, that's even less time than I thought. I think I'm realizing now it's less than 2 months I knew him, and I would go to meet with him and speak with him, and basically, I literally made, like, poster boards saying, "Here's my life. Here's everything I went through." And then he died. And his story very much influences my addiction because it was a very ambiguous grief I felt in losing this man that in many ways I felt I had no right to grieve because I'd been raised by my mom. She'd given up everything for me. So losing my dad, being there for his last breaths, feeling all of the things that I didn't have suddenly right in front of me and still not within reach. This father that was still slipping through my fingers. It brought up a lot of pain, and I didn't know how to process that. And I started drinking a lot. And it's interesting because the reason that I hadn't known my dad is because he was a drug addict and because he'd left. And then I started to do the thing, I started to like grow into the addict that he had become. Vicodin specifically was a way that I could not have to feel nervous or anxious or sad or any of the things that felt bad. And people, when you're drinking, you might slur your words or you might smell like alcohol. With Vicodin, to my knowledge, which was not the case, I just appeared normal. And that's all I wanted, was to be able to live in this world like all of you and just feel normal. And I want to name the fact that for many addicts, it is really a medication in some ways. I don't want to liken it to antidepressants or something because I think that's dangerous. I think there's doctors and medical diagnoses that really divorce that type of medication from this. But I was medicating something. And then, the line is crossed and it becomes something that takes over your life. I'd always like wanted to go to college, but I hadn't gotten into the colleges I wanted to. And I was seeing all of my friends in college, graduating college, and feeling behind and not being able to name that and instead kind of grasping for like, okay, what can I do to catch up? What can I do to compare myself and not feel bad? And I loved acting. I love performing. And I decided this is what I will do. I really committed to it and moved down to LA. And it was a really incredible experience. I got to do a lot of really neat things and work for Oscar winning actors and see the life that I wanted. But it was also like I was always on the outside looking in. You often feel othered. I still had all of the old insecurities, there's something wrong with me. My body isn't right. My looks aren't right. My skills aren't right. Trying to overcompensate. And I also realized that I got a lot of praise when I would book something that people from high school would see. I was so attached to what these people thought of me. But again, I was in a lot of discomfort. And again, you find ways to numb. I was in my early 20s, so were my friends. A lot of them were just doing that like recreational drinking and partying. But what started off as fun slowly and then very quickly turned into like a life ruining, almost ending wrecking ball in my life addiction. The threshold of what you need gets higher in addiction. What it takes one day to just feel okay, it's going to take more than that the next week. And it's going to take more than that the week after that. And my addiction kept growing, but my bank account wasn't. And I was struggling financially. And I was also, in many ways, still maintaining this life that, from at least my perspective, it looked very normal. I was a nanny for two families. I loved kids. I was a waitress at a restaurant and I was working for an actor. I had like 5 jobs at once and I was keeping all of them, but I wasn't making enough money to support my habit. I'll just say that. I was raised with this idea of like right and wrong. And I say that, but I also think it's just imbued in me. It's like I know how I feel when I do something good, and I know how I feel when I do something that hurts someone. And at some point, my addiction started to override that feeling. I will do things to hurt you in order to get this next pill. I started doing things that were just so out of character and hiding them. At the time was a nanny for a few different families and I was really trusted. I'm a mom now with kids and I employ nannies and or babysitters, and having someone in your home with your children, it's a really vulnerable leap of faith. And my kind of crux, the worst parts of my addiction were happening when I was in that position. And I started to do things that compromised the trust of those families and just be a person that was so far from who I wanted to be in the world. And I wish I could say that that was what finally made me stop using drugs. Because even knowing that, even being so deeply aware of who I wanted to be and who I was, I felt like I was in a train that was just being driven by something that I couldn't control. And luckily, I say now, the train totally derailed without my knowing or wanting by being found out. And essentially, like my whole life falling apart because my addiction was discovered and I lost my job. My car was repossessed. My relationship at the time ended. a lot of my friends just stopped talking to me. A lot of things fell apart at once. And I thought it was the worst thing in the world. I thought my whole life was over. And for someone that cared so much what people thought of me, to have all of these different masks fall away at once, I felt like terrible. And yet, it's ultimately what saved my life. And I can look back and be grateful for it. My mom let me come home, and I was sort of honest, sort of not about what was happening. But I told her that I was an addict. I had to be honest to some extent because it was a big enough blow up in my life. Through a series of fortunate events and also like highly uncomfortable, vulnerable ones, I came back here to Sacramento and I ended up in a county funded rehab. It was like the beginning of realizing how little drugs and alcohol actually had to do with what was like wrong with me or what was happening. For one, I think one of the first things that I started to realize when I got into recovery is that like, what if I had always kind of started to view myself as just a complete screw up? Something's wrong with me. I'm a bad person. Bad people do these things, and I did these things. But in recovery and around these other people who were sharing their stories about people doing things similar to what I had done, and the shame began to slowly get removed and replaced by this realization that I was sick and not bad. And whether or not you agree with that, there's a permission that happens when you stop viewing yourself as a bad person, a healing and recovery that is possible only when you're not full of shame and self judgment. And I think I really got that from being around other people and their stories and their experiences. And I began to see what I now know is hope for someone that was like feeling bad about not graduating college at the same time as my friends. For me to now be like a complete in debt, I almost went to jail. I had experienced so many consequences that were like so off course. And I got really humbled and I got really hopeful just by hearing my story from other people. So that was a big part of my early recovery, was by being willing to think, well, if it's possible for her to have done XYZ, and now she is like functioning like someone I would want to be like, maybe it's possible for me. I think that in the 12-step recovery model, I learned a lot of basics about just how to take care of myself emotionally, how to figure out when I was being driven by fear. That was one of the biggest gifts recovery gave me, because in retrospect, a lot of my life had been driven by fear. And it was that fear in the driver's seat, fear of consequences if I got honest with someone. And by realizing that and then asking, well, if I'm not going to live my life by fear, like who else can I be? What else is possible? And really finding a guide for that in the 12 steps, where we learn to do things like take an inventory of ourselves and our traits and our characteristics and maybe the behaviors that I had been engaging in that had been setting my life up in a way that was like ripe for poor relationships or resentments or things that always just felt like outside of my control. There is a power in simply taking substances out. And in that place, when we take out the medicine, asking, okay, well, I still need medicine. And where can I find that? And where I found it was in the rooms of 12-step meetings, in the community of people who didn't look at me as bad and sick. I found it in mindfulness. You know, there's that cliche one day at a time idea in recovery, and it's also like mind-blowingly helpful because so many of my problems came from the future. And so when I realized that I could just stay in the day, you know, play the tape forward, which is like thinking about how my actions might have consequences, but literally just doing things one day, one breath, one step at a time. That is something I still turn to repeatedly. It's been almost 11 years for me now that I haven't had to put anything in my body to change the way that I felt. And it's so neat to realize that I think, again, I think a lot of us addicts, alcoholics are highly sensitive, highly feeling, deeply creative, really just tender people. And it's not to say that we're better than, you know, people who never struggled with addiction or alcoholism. But I also think that if we can find it in ourselves to claim our power back from substances and find a sturdiness that doesn't lie outside of ourselves, but instead is from within, I think so much beauty is possible. And I mean, the whole reason, you know, as I was thinking about sharing my story here, I was like, what's the point of getting sober? Like, why do it? Really, and think about for like a normal person who just drinks for fun. They would probably just want to keep drinking, right? For me, there's a freedom that comes from, I feel like we all have an antenna to like God or the universe, our own highest path, the life that we could be living. And it's like when I am clear-minded and without substances in my body and grounded in myself and in my power, that antenna is like boom, like tuned, right? And I can follow it. Even though there's a bunch of noise, like I can return to that. And my antenna was like bent back when I was an addict. And it gets bent when I roam far from the anchor that I've begun to sort of build within myself. And at the very bottom of that, there's so many things I do in my life now to be okay because I'm still a really deeply feeling person. I still care what people think. I still struggle with old stories and old shame. Like that's okay. That didn't change, and also it did because I don't necessarily run away with them anymore. I don't buy into my thoughts. Thoughts are not facts. Thoughts are not things. We can think about getting loaded and then like watch the thought pass. We can watch our thoughts and not buy into them. I think that's a gift, again, of getting sober. There's just so many things that would not have been possible in my life had I not just had my entire world crumble. It wasn't a choice. But then it became a daily choice after that, and I'm so grateful for it. My life today is so beautiful and abundant and hard and all of the things, but at the very bedrock is my sobriety, because if I wasn't sober, I wouldn't be able to follow through on things. I wouldn't be able to be an accountable friend. I wouldn't have my health, as I'm getting a little bit older and you start to think about like longevity and impermanence, like all of that is made better by being sober. And yeah, I still think, oh, it's so cool that some people get to just drink for fun or like go do mushrooms. Those sound awesome. But for me, the fun would not be as big as the consequences. I am so content to never do those things and instead reap the benefits of my antenna staying pretty tuned to the universe. A big part of my story is losing my mom when I was just over a year sober. And she was my everything. In many ways, my best friend, my only parent, my higher power in many ways. And I didn't realize that until later. And we talk about higher power in recovery, this idea that you can get help from a power greater than yourself. I mentioned my mom in that sense because for me, she was the reason I knew I would always be okay. That no matter what happened, no matter how big I screwed up, no matter how badly I was hurting, that I think on some level I thought I would always have her until I didn't. And she died really unexpectedly and really suddenly, and I was left with this vacancy of a God, and also this awareness of just the deepest sorrow and pain that I've ever experienced, of course, since. It's been the biggest loss of my life. And I mention it because I think that the truth is, in life, you're going to suffer. And I know they always say suffering is optional, but I think that, when you deeply love, the truth is that you're also going to deeply lose. And that many people who are struggling to get sober probably have pain in their past. If you're watching this and that's you, just thinking of something that has deeply affected you that might feel like it's almost lurking, waiting to come up because we drink for reasons, right? We numb for reasons. And losing her and staying sober through it after losing my dad, this different loss, and not, I just want to say that it is still the deepest pain I've ever been in, and it will never go away. But also, I have been able to process it and feel it and alchemize it and let her spirit and her love and her light shine through me. I haven't numbed myself. I guess I just want to name that life is hard and things will happen and you can do hard things and we can get through them. And no matter what, whether we struggle and lose, we're going to do those things anyway. And that pain will be waiting whether we decide to get loaded or not. So that's something I thought about a lot after I lost her is like, I could just numb out, but it'll still be here. I'll still have to face it. And then I'll have a whole new set of problems. And what a gift to be able to feel things as they come. Sobriety gives us that gift.
My last question, Melissa, is what is sobriety?
What is sobriety? I mean, on its face, I think my quick answer would be refraining from indulging in those things that are numbing us, because I guess we could be sober from a whole litany of things. So that might be a little bit ambiguous, but not putting substances in my body when I know that something is numbing me, becoming aware of that and getting curious about it and trying not to judge myself for it and just asking, like, what's hurting? This is something I do a lot. Put my hand on my heart. It's an inner child thing. What's hurting? I'm here. And you don't have to, eat that gallon of ice cream unless you really want to, unless it feels good. You don't have to numb out with social media, hand on heart and just checking in. I got you. That's sobriety. The gifts that have come my way as a result of sobriety, I think the biggest gift is feeling like I'm no longer looking at some path over there and saying, that's where I should be. And the agony of that, regret, and not even just in an egotistical way, not even like, oh, I should have all that money or I should have that career, but I should be a good person. I should be someone whose word you can count on. I am that person. I am a human, but I think a real big gift is that, I don't want to die tomorrow, but if I did, I'd feel pretty solid in my relationships and my interactions. And when I have issues with people, I talk about it. I'm willing to have really uncomfortable conversations because I think it's actually way kinder to be ourselves and be truthful, especially like in friendship or in intimacy. And then as far as like the blessings that I can actually see, I have been able to, I paid off all my debt in sobriety. I told you when I got sober, I had like tens of thousands of dollars in debt. I was able to buy a house. I was able to hold down a job, and I've been running my own business for 7 years now. I've published 8 books. I've got 2 incredible daughters. I think that's definitely my biggest blessing, is feeling like I am a mom who is, gosh, I'm so grateful to not be numbing myself with them, because motherhood is the most fulfilling and wildest and most intense and most difficult thing I've ever done. And being sober for it and like here for it, what a gift. I can't imagine doing it any other way. Yeah, I think motherhood is probably the biggest blessing. I think about if I hadn't been able to get sober, if I hadn't been able to be these girls' mom, what I would have missed out on. Thank you for letting me share my story.
Hi, I'm Kenny Hill with Recovery Hill. My intention here is to show the diversity of sobriety. How one finds themselves clawing from bottom is as nuanced as their journey to bottom. And their situation in recovery has the potential to be highly relatable to somebody who is watching. Therefore, I offer the interviewees to have total freedom to express whatever has worked for them, whatever has helped them sustain sobriety. That said, here at the end of the interview, I want to make a quick request so that it wasn't to take away from the interview itself. This request is that you like and share the video. You can subscribe if you want, that's up to you, but at least like and share it so that the content can get to as many people as possible. There is a great capacity and potential for the story you just watched to be able to help out somebody else to begin their story of recovery.